The big story, of course, that we're following for you on eNCA. It's an hour before Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana delivers the 2023 budget speech. The country's electricity crisis is top of that agenda as we continue experiencing rolling blackouts with stage 6 currently taking place. The question, however, is will we see another Eskom bailout? Last year, Godongwana announced a tightening on bailouts for state-owned entities. Let's cross now to eNCA's Rofhiwa Madzena, who's outside Parliament ahead of that speech. Rofhiwa, last year during his medium-term budget policy speech, he had some other things that he's supposed to outline today in terms of the money that will be dispersed, for instance, to state-owned entities or not. Are we expecting him to make clarity on that, or the importance right now is the energy crisis?
That's a very important question, Masako, coming to you from a sunny Cape Town at the City Hall, like you say, just ahead of the delivery of the budget speech. And there are a lot of questions that are lingering on all the major issues that you just touched on. And it's going to be a difficult task for the minister because he's basically got a mini pizza that he has to share with a family of about 8 or 10. And how do you distribute accordingly, and what do you prioritize, particularly when you've got the big money guzzler, which is Eskom, that is demanding more and more resources. But I'm not the expert. I've got Dr. Nthabiseng Muleko, who joins us this afternoon. She's an economist, and she'll be with us until the minister starts his speech. A very good afternoon to you. Do you prefer Nthabiseng or Doc? Either way.
I'm easy. Whatever you can.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And maybe let's start with that broad question. We were lucky in the commodity super cycle that assisted National Treasury to have some extra money to fiddle around with in the previous fiscal year. We're probably going to see something similar this year, but there are priorities, and it seems as though the big one is Eskom that's going to be taking from other important sectors within the economy.
So thanks for the question. I think, Rofhiwa, the first thing is that we always get saved by our additional fiscus, additional income that we collect and revenue collected from the tax windfalls that come from commodities boom. And so you get your mining revenues. You must remember the CIT, the corporate income tax, is the third highest component of our revenue collection. So overall, it does somewhat help in terms of reducing that deficit that we expect. So we did collect just over 1.5 trillion in terms of revenue, but we always spend more than we collect, and hence we have that budget deficit. But they have been targeting a primary surplus in the next 3 years, and we're going to see whether that comes through in the 2024-25 year. But you are right when you talk about the Eskom constraints. They are going to have a very serious impact in terms of not just the growth outlook, but also on the consumers, households, SMMEs. Our small businesses are suffering the downtime, the effect on manufacturing, equipment losses, having to replace and find alternative energy solutions is a significant capital cost in terms of infrastructure. If we talk about Eskom, you've got to look at 3 aspects. The issue of the debt and the debt solvency issue at Eskom. Eskom has 422 billion in terms of debt. It has to be resolved. We do know that previously in the medium-term budget policy statement, Minister did mention that there was a resolve to have 2/3 of that debt come onto the balance sheet of the government. That means that the taxpayer, us, we will now be responsible, and the future generations will be transferred that debt and have to now start repaying that debt because it will now be taken on. The details of that we will probably hear today, but we've been waiting for a long time to hear how the restructuring of the Eskom debt will be resolved. This is not going to solve the operational, the managerial
and that's what everyone is wondering,
problems of
does
Eskom.
This create an immediate solution to the operational issues?
Not at
that
all.
we're seeing?
Not at all. So the issue of the solvency of Eskom, so that it can get on with the business of providing us electricity and generate electricity and distribute and transmit energy, that will now be the main problem instead of it dealing with bankruptcy and solvency issues, right? So that's number one. The second aspect is, how do we fix the problems of Eskom? Eskom load shedding, I call it blackouts, because really that's what it is. We are having ongoing blackouts, scheduled blackouts. We're being told to get used to having these blackouts that the country must get used to, which are having a significant impact on our GDP. So our growth numbers are contracting, and we are seeing a slowing of growth Last year, we saw contracting of GDP by over a percentage point. We're seeing manufacturing contract consistently in the last quarter of last year. The same thing will happen this year when we see numbers released from quarter one of this year. And we're seeing at least a less than 10% increase in output because of the impact of load shedding. In rand values, it's more than hundreds of billions that's affecting across the value chain our sustainability.
Yeah.
And economic growth is now estimated at around 0.3% by the Reserve Bank.
That's scary. By the
That's
Reserve
nothing.
Bank, yeah.
So what we want to see is how will we resolve the managerial problem of Eskom, the generation of power, the maintenance of those power stations. I'm not an energy expert, but if I was thinking about it from an economic perspective, I would ask myself, what is the human resource strategy that is going to be put in place? How are we going to get engineers?
Yeah.
How are we going to get engineers in the power stations? How are we going to make sure that the pricing strategy of Eskom is sustainable into the future so they don't need to be resolved and given another 400 billion or 200 billion solvency bailout by the state? And what is going to be put in place as a condition for Eskom and its executives and the board in terms of this bailout? There should be contingent restrictions that are put on place so that we don't find ourselves 5-10 years from here in the very same situation.
Getting a return on investment, basically, not just watching the money flow away. Another big one, and you and I were actually speaking to the president of the PSA, Dr. Rofhiwa Madzena, earlier on, and they are determined to get above inflation increases as public sector workers. And they say if they don't get that, they will shut the country down. How does the minister begin to address this issue of the wage bill, the pushback that he's been getting from the unions?
Well, it's about social compact, really. I think what has the minister previously agreed to with the Public Sector Association or Public Service Association and also FEDUSA and other unions, right? We all know that there's a cost of living crisis globally. It's not just a South African problem. And really because of supply side hikes and prices, the resource issue of fuel and how that spiked up prices affecting the entire food, manufacturing and our own pockets when you buy fuel just to get to work. So most South Africans now are surviving net just trying to get to work day to day. They're poorer than they were a year ago because the increases that they've received are not higher than inflation. And I think that we're at a time when we need leadership.
Yeah.
Leaders have to make decisive choices and take decisive action to show what exactly they can do to try and get everyone married to a unified approach for the good of the country. And I think that's what leadership is. I'm not sure if it's enough to simply say we're not interested in increasing at a certain point. The effect of another shock on the economy of having public sector strikes in the long run is also going to have a lagged effect of slowing down access to basic services for the people who need them the most. And I think that they really have to enter and see what is the necessary way forward on this. But I think it's a leadership issue, and I think that has to be resolved.
Hopefully it will be resolved. Masako, really important topics being discussed over there. We're going to give it back to you in studio for a moment, but when we come back, we're going to be talking about the grey listing. Many economists already saying we have been grey listed. It's a done deal. What we want to hear from the ministers, how do we get out of it? Can we be like a Mauritius that was out within 18 months, putting in the right policies? And then we'll also talk taxes. The commodity super cycle has come to an end. Government is going to need other forms of revenue. Essentially, they're going to have to grow the economy. And Tabi Singh will tell us how, if it's even possible.